Rain had a way of polishing facades. The glass of the Verona Group's headquarters shimmered under a gray sky, and the lobby's imported carpet drank the last of the morning downpour in muted, expensive silence. Lucas Andrade moved through that quiet like a shadow born of intention. Work boots scuffed with city mud, a neon safety vest zipped over a plain shirt, a small toolbox in one hand and a maintenance clipboard tucked under his elbow. He let the building treat him as it had trained itself to treat its unseen helpers, with brisk nods, quick sidesteps, and often no notice at all. He had not always walked these corridors in boots. He had once signed their lease agreements, argued over the oak paneling in the boardroom, and decided where the coffee budget would go. Today, however, Lucas wanted to see what people did when they thought power was absent. He was careful not to wear arrogance like a crown. He wore anonymity like a lens. At reception, a woman paused to glance at him and then returned to the stack of forms on her desk. Overhead, the usual river of conversations continued, a cadence of greetings, phones tapping, the faint hiss of the espresso machine. Bianca Montero, newly appointed administrative manager, crossed the lobby with her own rhythm, an efficient click of heels, a power suit that fit like armor, eyes sharp as a pencil. She had been at Verona for only 2 weeks, and the building had already learned her tempo. She carried herself with the kind of precision that did not invite casual interruption. Her hands were steady, her jaw set, and there was a clipboard tucked under her arm that matched the exact angle of her posture. People assumed she was cold. They assumed she was ambitious. Most also assumed she had nothing soft left inside to spare. Lucas watched her from the edge of the seating area as she passed. He saw a flicker on her face, a practiced expression of composure, but he also noticed the crease at her brow that deepened when she scanned for inefficiency. He told himself he would move only to observe, not to entangle. Then a courier rounded the corner, carrying a stack of interoffice mail too high for one person to manage. The pile wobbled. The top envelope slipped and fluttered out, striking Lucas's shoulder and depositing itself on the carpet at his feet. He bent to pick it up, balancing his toolbox and clipboard, when Bianca, in the same breathless managerial hurry, stopped and leaned over him. "You there, watch where you're going," she said, the words precise, the tone public and unyielding. Heads turned, phone stilled. A small crowd of employees watched the minor theater. Her voice was not cruel, it was clinical, like a punctured hole in decorum that let the humidity of judgment leak through. Lucas straightened, smoothing the envelope he had retrieved. His boots were soaked at the seams.
He looked up to meet her eyes and saw no recognition, only the professional annoyance of a woman guarding her precinct. He could have responded as the man under the vest, or he could have bitten and revealed a patience sharpened by position. He did neither. "You should be more careful," Bianca added, a little louder, directed as much at the watching as at him. "We don't have time for clutters and sloppiness." Someone chuckled on the far side of the foyer. Conversation resumed, but now it flowed with another current, the hum of a woman publicly corrected. The courier, red-faced, tried to apologize and was promptly dismissed. Lucas tucked the envelope under his arm and walked on, past the clover-shaped chairs and the framed corporate awards that glittered like teeth. As he left, a thin, cream-colored sheet slipped from the envelope, its corner catching on the edge of the carpet. When he bent to retrieve it, the leather folder beneath his tools shifted, and a single paper fell loose and fluttered to the floor. It was a small, almost ordinary piece of paper, but there was a signature across its bottom in a heavy, practiced hand. Lucas Andrade, Chairman. For a moment it lay there like a tiny, impossible seed. Bianca's heels carried her away before she noticed. The world did not tilt. The crowd only remembered her curt admonition. And Lucas, who could have called her out then and there, instead slipped the paper into his pocket. He did not want to shame her. He wanted to know. If you love stories with a twist, subscribe. He made a slow, deliberate choice in that moment. Observation, not exposure. He called Gustavo, his executive assistant, and left a terse message instructing quiet measures. Gustavo arrived at the maintenance entrance himself later that morning, a whisper in a dark suit, eyes that already knew how to decode corporate human calculus. The assistant moved through the staff like a careful hand, noting faces and schedules, collecting impressions as if they were coins. Gustavo's report was a gentle but thorough unspooling of truth. Over the course of a few discreet conversations and a small ethical thread of inquiry, he discovered the lines that had shaped Bianca. She had been an orphan since adolescence, he'd learned. A modest scholarship had carried her through university. She sent most of her first paychecks home to a small apartment outside the city, where her younger brother lived. He was visually impaired, dependent in ways that were not always visible to colleagues. His name was Raphael. Gustavo had found someone at reception who'd seen Bianca fold sandwiches into foil and tuck them into a bag for the late-night guard. He'd found a rent ledger in a drawer the color of exhaustion. He had even seen a faded photograph in the personnel file, a girl with a narrow smile and a boy in a bright red sweater. Lucas held each fact like a fragile object.
He had known about fiscal risk and market forecasts for years. He had not, until now, known the architecture of Bianca's survival. An armor of discipline was often worn by those who had to be a fortress for someone else. He felt a shift. The test would not be to humiliate a proud woman into contrition, but to create the conditions in which her pride could choose gentleness. He did not act alone. The audit he scheduled was genuine. Internal processes needed inspection. But it was also adaptable, a lens through which behavior could be observed at scale. The audit would not be a trap or a public reckoning. It would be a slow unveiling, set in motion to allow the truth to reveal itself. He moved like a conductor with one hand behind his back, present if needed, invisible otherwise. In the days that followed, the building revealed its textures. Bianca's management style was efficient to the point of cruelty at times. She preferred memos to meetings and discipline to debate. She corrected the office barista for latte art that took too long. She revoked flex time when she judged people lazy. On an external level, she was everything a company might prize: punctual, decisive, and seemingly impervious to sentiment. But Lucas watched the preface to that hardness. He watched Bianca linger by a photo of a group of interns, eyes softening for the briefest beat before she turned away. He saw her quiet in the stairwell, taking a breath that was more than air. He watched the way her fingers fumbled with a receipt before tucking it into her wallet, as if it were a promise she could not break. One morning, the elevator between floors stopped. It was the kind of mechanical hiccup that trapped people in metal for a moment too long. Inside were three people: Bianca, an intern named Marco who was bright-eyed and new, and Lucas in his maintenance jacket. The mercury of tension rose with the minutes. The elevator hummed. The light overhead whispered with a reluctant bulbiness. Bianca's first instinct was control. She pressed the emergency button and then checked the panel, a manager's reflex. Marco started to fidget, clarifying he had a presentation in 15 minutes. Lucas, who could have stepped aside into silence, listened. "This won't take long," Bianca told Marco, her voice flat, professional, the tone of someone keeping a ledger. Marco's hand shook as he clutched his stack of papers. "I'm sorry, I'm new." "It's not about being new," Bianca said. "It's about being prepared." She meant to steady him. The public had witnessed her earlier scoldings and stored them in memory as abrasions. But in here, in metal and interrupted breath, other things came loose. Marco laughed nervously and started to apologize again. Bianca sighed, and for a second the armor around her neck loosened just enough for Lucas to see a seam. "You seem nervous," Lucas said quietly. His voice did not seek to scold her for tone or posture. It aimed instead for the soft joint of human anxiety. "What's your presentation about?" Her jaw shifted with the impulse to control who spoke. "Cost reduction in the procurement cycle," Marco said. Bianca's eyes flicked to him with a flash of pride at his competency. She had trained him, in a way, or at least people like her did not let potential be wasted. There was a pause, and then a hum of humor shifted into the car. The elevator technician had been called, and a man's voice, calm and reassuring, spoke through the speaker. Bianca took out her phone and checked the time. She looked at Marco, and very quietly, softened a little. "Tell me the first line," she asked. He hesitated, then said it, and his voice steadied. Bianca nodded, a small, almost private recognition pulling her posture into a less guarded shape. When the doors finally slid open and the minutes broke into the hall, she put a hand on Marco's shoulder, a gesture so slight it could have been missed by the most casual observer. For Marco, it was a lifeline. For Lucas, it was a crack in a dam he had not thought to measure. Pride did not exclude tenderness. Another incident arrived like a bell. An intern spilled coffee in the cafeteria. The cup burst and brown warmth splattered across a young woman's white blouse. Several people laughed, the reflexive cruelty of awkwardness. Bianca, arriving seconds later, saw the stain and the flocking eyebrows, and did what she had always been trained to do. She took the role of corrector, pointing out safety concerns, admonishing the intern for carelessness. The intern wilted in public humiliation, her cheeks blazing like a warning light. Lucas, who had watched each movement and felt the tug of his ethics, stepped forward, stooped, and in the softest voice he could muster, offered the intern a clean towel and a spare blouse from his own toolbox,
A ridiculous thing to carry in a maintenance case, maybe, but he had things for every contingency, whether plumbing or human. Bianca's reaction was immediate. She frowned, the managerial barometer of shame rising, but then she slipped away and returned with something small, a package of antiseptic wipes and a quiet apology to the intern, spoken not to the crowd but to the person. Later, in the supply closet, she pressed her hand to the locker as if steadying herself, and took a breath that tasted of the same worry she had carried into the elevator with Marco. She had punished quickly in the cafeteria to hold the shape of her authority. She had then redeemed herself privately. That dissonance, public hardness and private care, was a chord Lucas wanted to hear again. He watched her leaving one evening with a brown paper bag of food. The guard at the side door called out hello, and she handed him a bag without ceremony.
When she thought no one was looking, she paused by a column and looked at a small, tattered photograph she carried in her wallet of a boy with a bright smile, his eyes sheltered behind thick glasses. She spoke a single name under her breath: Raphael. Lateness, lack of sleep, and unwavering schedule, they had all been purchased at a price she would not let the company pay. Rumors swelled as the audit approached. Whispers traveled faster than memos. People speculated the founder might show up, that the board might surprise the company. Bianca took to pacing the glassed hallway that separated the executive suites from the rest. She rehearsed phrases in front of her phone as if she were practicing for a verdict. In between, she checked the maintenance cart that had been left in her path one afternoon. The leather folder Lucas carried had been set down by a careless contractor. For a moment, she saw the corner of a paper poke out, a slanted flourish of a name. But a janitor whistled, and people passed, and she did not have time to notice. The hint was there, a thread that slid past the eye. When she finally did notice it, a signature on the corner of a contractor itinerary Lucas had left behind for reasons small and practical, it startled her like a cold hand. The name was familiar from emails she'd seen in the company intranet. It was a name she had, in the pressure of budget meetings, both admired and resented. She folded the paper back into the folder, but the crease remained in the mind of the company like a small, persistent echo. Her chest tightened. She did not know yet if it was fear or recognition she felt. The audit would bring the answer. The auditorium was full on the day Lucas decided to speak. Rows of chairs held employees whose year-old lanyards swung with a gentle rhythm. The board had been asked to attend. Bianca sat near the middle, a posture of someone who had practiced not to be the center of attention. The stage was for quarterly figures, updates, and the occasional motivational speaker. Today it would also be for truth. Lucas walked through the aisles alone, the same man who had been scolded in the lobby and who had fixed photocopier jams in the basement. His suit, tailored in a way that signaled more than a good tailor, the comfort of a man who had lived in his role, fit him like a second skin. He carried nothing. He did not need to make noise. He let silence be the instrument. "Good morning," he said, his voice even but carrying in the hall. There was a stir. No one clapped. Curiosity was not applause. He told them plainly that he had spent the last few weeks walking the building in different clothing to understand how employees treated one another when hierarchy might err on the side of invisibility. There was no melodrama in his confession.
His description of a rainy morning, a maintenance vest, a dropped interoffice envelope, the specifics painted a small scene in the minds of those who had witnessed it, and a larger one for those who hadn't. Bianca felt the earth tilt. Her memory supplied the corridor exchange with a clarity that had been muffled by the noise of daily life. Faces in the crowd turned. Someone gasped. The auditorium was a room built for echoes, and every sound seemed to find its echo. "I did it because a company is not only its profits," Lucas continued. "It's people, speaking to and for people. It is the small kindnesses, the small attentions to dignity that keep a moral architecture standing." He did not point fingers like spears. He did not demand confessions. He told one story, the story of a leader who wanted to understand what dignity looked like from those who thought they were invisible. When he finished, there was a quiet like the end of a tide. Eyes lowered, some looking at the soles of shoes as if measurement might be decisive. Bianca sat there, stunned by the public misalignment between her earlier rebuke and the revelation that the man she'd admonished owned the building and the company and many of the decisions that shaped her life. Shame tightened and began to climb the back of her throat like an animal in need of breath. But Lucas did not dwell on her specifically. He had seeded the field for recovery rather than for ruin. After the meeting, he asked to speak with her privately. The space they chose was the panoramic office on the top floor, glass walls that offered the city like a map.
It was a room that had been, for decades, where decisions met consequences. Now it held only two people and the exhausted weather of the day's revelations. Bianca stood rigid at the threshold, a posture designed to protect. Her fingers twisted around the strap of her bag. For a moment she looked like a girl in front of a parent, waiting to be judged. Lucas gestured for her to sit. There was no theater in his voice, only the steady cadence of someone who had seen enough of human failure to know how to begin mending it. "I could have fired you," he said, without flourish. "You humiliated a man in the lobby. That is poor leadership. We can't have that from our managers." She swallowed the breath that rose like a hot coal. "I thought he was careless. He looked like he didn't belong." "Perhaps," Lucas conceded, "but the way we correct matters. A manager should rise in a way that holds another's dignity, even when that manager is angry." She had expected a different wrath, a public reprimand perhaps, or a sharper collapse. Instead, she received a kind of moral arithmetic. Wrongs counted, yes, but not as a means to break, as a means to adjust. He handed her an envelope. Her pulse threatened to spill itself into the silence. "This," Lucas said, "is for you." She knew the rituals of corporate endings. Envelopes could be ceremonial, like a guillotine's notice.
She slid it open with a fingernail and withdrew a single sheet. The first paragraph read in the language of law and HR, "The company hereby relieves you of your duties as administrative manager immediately." Her throat closed. She looked up for the falling curtain, but then she read the next lines. They were not a final dismissal. They were a redirection. "However, we are offering you a position that requires both discipline and heart, executive assistant to the chairman. This role will involve direct mentoring on leadership that serves and protects dignity. It will be demanding and will require humility and courage. You will be paid at a rate commensurate with executive staff and will report directly to the chairman." Bianca felt as if she had been given a strange instrument and told to play it. Her first impulse was indignation. Demotion was a humiliating word, even if it contained a promise. Her second was practical. Could she afford the move? Her third, deepest and dampest, was relief. Relief that a new form of accountability might still contain a path to repair. When she finally managed a voice, it was low. "Is this a punishment?" Lucas let the question sit, not because he enjoyed it, but because he wanted the truth to form. "Partly," he admitted. "It is also an opportunity. I believe leadership should be taught at the place where it is hardest to learn. If you're willing, I will teach you how to lead so that you do not make the same mistake again." Her eyes shifted, and there, in the glass wall, she caught the reflection of a woman who had been trained to survive, to protect another life that depended on her steadiness. She thought of Raphael's face, of unpaid bills, of the quiet groceries she wrapped in foil and left at the guard station. Pride had kept her upright when everything else threatened to collapse. "Why me?" she asked quietly. "There are other managers who have made worse mistakes." "Because you can learn," Lucas said simply. "And because you have already shown in private that you know how to be kind. You just need to let that part of yourself lead." It was not an honor he bestowed as reward. It was a request to change. She could refuse and keep the post, or accept and step into something that would make her vulnerable. The vulnerability would be public and slow. It would require meetings where she would answer for decisions, mentoring sessions where she would be corrected, and time away from the power she had used as armor. She accepted. The weeks that followed were not cinematic. They were full of small, stubborn labor. Lucas assigned her tasks that were both practical and moral. She learned how to listen to people whose opinions were not mediated by hierarchy. She sat with staff in the cafeteria without a clipboard and took their complaints as problems to solve, not as weaknesses to correct.
She learned to track not just outputs, but well-being, to schedule walkthroughs that asked how families were doing and how time was spent, not merely which metrics had fallen. The company did not change overnight. Training sessions were followed by setbacks. One manager resisted, another mocked the soft approach. But the new tenor of conversation grew like a slow green shoot. Human resource policies were rewritten to include explicit dignity clauses. Mentoring hours became a line item on quarterly reviews. Interns who once feared correction now had assigned mentors. The cafeteria introduced meal vouchers for staff who worked overtime. Raphael's name, once only a ghost in Bianca's wallet, showed up on a community support list and later in a small, certified program that subsidized care. As Bianca learned to lead through service, Lucas learned something too. He had not set out to make himself liked. He had set out to create a system where people were less likely to be humiliated and more likely to be guided. Watching Bianca shift, he saw the edge of her pride soften into a discipline that included correction with care. He also watched his own expectations change. Where he had once been a distant architect, he now became a teacher whose lessons were learned in the company of someone who had been forged by necessity. They worked late together sometimes. Nights were when the city's light thinned and true conversations could occur away from the midday pretense. She taught him how charts affected the human beings who worked behind them. He taught her that power could be a tool used to protect rather than to punish. The chemistry between them was not sudden fireworks, but a slow alignment of respect. There were gentle moments, a shared cup of coffee at midnight, her hand briefly brushing his when passing a file, a laugh that came unexpectedly during a difficult meeting. Each was a brick laid into a structure that neither of them hurried to complete. Their romance did not function as recompense. It was not reward for her growth, nor the payment for contrition. It was instead the extension of the mutual regard they had cultivated, two people who had learned from one another and chosen to remain in that tutelage. They never used affection as leverage. They never conflated personal intimacy with professional advantage. The line was drawn and respected, because both had seen the damage that blurred lines could do. Months later, the company celebrated an anniversary. The lobby had been rearranged to host a small gathering of staff and board members and a handful of families who had been touched by the new programs. The carpet smelled faintly of polished wood and pastries. Raphael was there, assisted by a cane but laughing like any young man on the edge of a life. He hugged his sister the moment they saw each other, and somewhere in the lobby someone began to clap. Lucas and Bianca stood side by side at the podium.
The crowd stilled, attentive to the two who had, in the course of a stormy year, redrawn the company's moral cartography. Lucas spoke softly about leadership as a verb, not a title. Bianca stepped forward and told a story, not of her mistakes, but of the things that had shaped her. A boy who could not see well, but whose laughter had taught her to see differently. A mother who had taught her to cook with the economy of love. The night she stood by a hospital window and decided she would never let dependence be a reason for cruelty. There was no grand theology in her words. She spoke of duty and humility, of the cost of upholding standards without compassion. She thanked the interns who had taught her how to be patient, and the guard who had accepted her sandwiches as if they were small acts of grace. The company had shifted in ways that were measurable and immeasurable. Turnover stabilized. Employee surveys reflected an increase in trust. The receptionist no longer hurried to dismiss a maintenance worker. She greeted him. Mentorship logs filled. A policy was created to support families of staff with special needs, a direct outcome of a conversation sparked when Lucas had simply asked one night, "Who are you really doing this for?" At the end of the celebration, as the rain returned and the city wrapped itself again in gray, Lucas and Bianca walked out to the curb beneath shared umbrellas. People passed them with a nod that had the softness of recognition. "Did you ever think," Bianca asked, "that the man I scolded would be the one standing next to me now?" Lucas looked at her, at the woman who had learned to lead differently, and whose laughter had begun to belong to other people as well. "No," he admitted, "but I had hoped." She leaned into him as they waited for a taxi, fingers laced. "Do you ever forgive yourself?" she asked, half to him, half to a past version of herself who had used harshness like a shield. "Yes," he said. "I forgive the man I was that needed to test people in that way. I forgive the leader who thought he could buy empathy. We build it together now." In the months and years that followed, stories about Verona's culture spread slowly, like good rumors. Other companies asked how they had turned around their policies. Bianca's name was listed not as a cautionary example, but as a case study in growth, a manager who had learned to hold power with gentleness. Lucas remained a founder with a clear mind for strategy, but he had found a strange sort of profit in living with dignity as a baseline. Sometimes in the quiet that arrives where noise has been a long tenant, they would remember the corridor and the paper that had fallen without being noticed. They would tell the story differently depending on who was in the room, sometimes as a warning, sometimes as an encouragement. They never framed it as entertainment.
They framed it as an invitation, a reminder that everyone they met had a history and a heart that could be wounded or soothed by a single sentence. It was a lesson Lucas and Bianca had learned the hard and tender way. At an anniversary dinner years later, when Raphael introduced Bianca as more than his sister, as his advocate, his employer's partner, and a leader in her own right, there was a hush of satisfaction in the room. A small child at a neighboring table looked up with wide eyes, and Lucas, watching them, thought of the rainy morning with a smile full of memory. People sometimes ask where grace begins. For them, it had begun at the intersection of humility and choice. The choice not to shame in public, the choice to teach rather than to punish, and the choice to offer a hand when one could have simply pointed a finger. Sometimes God hides lessons in the smallest moments, they would say later, a dropped page, a held breath, a soft apology. They never used that phrase as a sermon. It was simply how they had learned to narrate their life. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs a reminder about humility and respect.